Thanks for the introduction, Mike, and good afternoon, everybody. So, as Mike said, we're going to do a shared presentation between myself, Sarah and Shane, and I'm going to be focusing on the regulatory element in relation to risk assessment and risk management. So firstly, I just wanted to recap, I suppose, on the Drinking Water Directive that came in a number of years ago and the Drinking Water Regulations from 2023 that we would have spoke about at the conference in September 2023, and just some of the updates and the publications that has happened since that date. So in terms of the new regulations, it doesn't fundamentally change how water is regulated and audited, but there is more of a focus now in relation to risk assessment and risk management, and more importantly, the reporting element of it. So there's reporting that has to take place. There's a lead-in since the regulations came in 2023, which I will explain as well. And it also introduces, I suppose, a standardised approach to the risk assessment, risk management, both in terms of approaches and the methods and how the outcomes are reported to and by the regulator. So when I talk about the regulator in terms of the group water scheme sector, I'm referring to the local authorities, who's the regulator excuse me, for that sector. And the regulation does cover all elements from catchment right to abstraction, treatment, distribution and tap. But today we are just focusing on the risk assessment and risk management of the source catchment areas for both groundwaters and surface waters. So I'm going to be discussing mainly in relation to two documentations that's been published. In 2024, we had the technical guidance document that was published, and also then in May of this year, the implementation guidance, and I'm going to go through the details of that. And both of those are very relevant to group water schemes in terms of meeting the regulation requirements for carrying out these risk assessments that has to be met by July 2027. So just in relation to the risk assessment and risk management, the regulations require approaches to reflect water safety planning in line with World Health Organization guidelines, and there is documentation relevant to that as well. It's applicable to water suppliers or group water schemes that are serving greater than 10 cubic metres per day. I mentioned in relation to the reporting element that I'm going to talk about, and that has to be reported to the regulator, the local authority, at a minimum every 6 years. A lot of similarities to the National Federation's quality assurance system that has been in place for nearly 2 decades at this stage. So there's a lot of similarities in that sense in terms of looking at hazardous events, looking at pressures, putting control measures and putting record keeping in place. And Eddie gave some examples earlier in his talk before lunch. We just have the added reporting and tracking element that has to be made to the regulator, and from the regulator then on to the European Commission. So two of the documents that I mentioned earlier, first one in relation to a technical guidance document, and this was published by the department in July 2024. There was appointed consultants to undertake this work. We had Tobins and CDM Smith that were providing technical assistance in terms of publishing this document. And there also was a national source protection expert subgroup that was also involved. The technical guidance document that is produced, it's up on the screen there on your left. It's a common framework for national approach to drinking water source protection, and it meets the Drinking Water Directive requirements in terms of a risk-based approach, but also catchment focused and trying to address risks, put risk management and risk assessment in place in terms of identifying pollutants, etc. There's a standardised approach in the document in terms of integrating the Drinking Water Directive with the Water Framework Directive. You know, remembering that the Water Framework Directive is aiming to improve the rivers and lakes and the water bodies up to good status, and the Drinking Water Directive is trying to ensure that the people who are drinking it, that it is safe drinking water. So there's a lot of integration between both of those directives. The technical guidance also very much aligns with the National Federation's framework that was published in 2029 for drinking water source protection. Just in relation to the second document that I mentioned, which is the implementation guidance, and this was published by the EPA in May of this year. There's a screenshot there on the screen from the EPA website, so the document can be downloaded and the associated templates as well. So it's, sets out a standardised approach for the methodology in terms of how to carry out risk assessments and put risk management plans in place. In terms of gathering the data and the information that's needed by water suppliers to be submitted to the regulator. Tracking the information over time is important. The document also sets out roles and responsibilities for various stakeholders, including source protection agencies that are outlined in the drinking water regulations as well. In addition to the document that's published, there's 2 Excel templates, and I'm going to go through what's contained in those templates in a little bit more detail. There is one template relates to for Uisce and the group water schemes, and the second template relates to small private supplies, and that's those providing drinking water mainly for commercial activity. So it could be a pub or hotel, etc., having their own water supply. They have a separate template to be completed. So I'm not going to go through every single section of the template that has to be populated, but there is a range. Most here are probably familiar with an Excel workbook. There's a range of tabs in the workbook, and within each of those there's questions that has to be answered. I've given some examples, and the tabs are really split into your risk assessment element and then your risk management, and most of them there you can see on the screen is in terms of risk assessment. You can see along the bottom in the blue there's one there in relation to green, and I'm going to expand on that in terms of added elements that we've included for the group water scheme purposes. So just to quickly run through then a little bit of detail that's in all the different tabs, and some of them, you know, are quite basic information that needs to be collected. What's the scheme name? Who's the contact detail? Where's the treatment plant located? Etc. So these first 3 that are in the booklet or in the template refer to gather enough basic information, and some of that you'd only have to populate it once and it wouldn't ever change again. In terms of the drinking water catchment tab there, the one on the right, in relation to delineations of your catchments, and all of the schemes, I think nearly all of them at this stage have had their catchments delineated, whether they have one catchment or multiple catchments. They have been delineated you know, in recent years. If there's schemes maybe that have new sources, they've drilled new groundwater sources, we have assistance there that will be available from the GSI in terms of doing high-level delineation for those schemes to meet the requirements here. A couple of other tabs that's included in the workbook. These 3 relate to water quality. So it's about looking at, and it's all part of the risk assessment process, gathering the water quality information, which could be from multiple sources. So schemes are doing some of their own monitoring. There's EPA monitoring stations there. You have perhaps a lot of schemes are in DBO bundles. The operators are doing monitoring. LawPro maybe is doing monitoring, and other sources. So there's a lot of information that's available out there. You may need to liaise with your local authority. They could be monitoring your source as well. So it's trying to gather what's out there as a first at a picture. And if there's additional monitoring or it's not sufficient, it may evolve into a bit of a risk management recommendation. So it's looking at the hazard, looking at the water quality that's out there, trending it, and comparing it to screening values as well. This element here I mentioned at the start in terms of maybe some additional information that's been included in the workbook, and we are doing that for the group water schemes. Sorry, apologies, next slide. So the template that has been published doesn't actually give a list of hazards to look at or to risk assess. It leaves that up to the water supplier. So we have been working on water safety planning over the last number of years, and there is an EPA Advice Note 8, and we have used that in terms of populating a list of potential hazards that may not apply to all schemes. Some of them are solely related to groundwater, some surface water. So we've used that as a basis for including a list of standard hazards that should be looked at from a catchment point of view, and we're including that into the template that we'll be working with group water schemes. So in terms of looking at the hazards, you're looking at a particular hazard, and Sarah's going to explain some examples in her talk. Is it an issue? If it is an issue, what's the likelihood that it's going to happen or it's going to occur? And if it does occur, how severe is the consequences going to be? So, you know, there's a multiplication there between the 2 scores, and the higher the risk, you know, the higher the action that you need to look at, and you need to focus at those ones that are scoring a lot higher. And as I said, Sarah's going to give some examples in her talk. So that sheet that I just explained really would come into a summary tab that's in the template. So they just provide the template in terms of the score. It's up to the water supplier to look at the hazardous events that might occur in their catchment area. Some hazards, when we would look at them initially, when we work with schemes on this, may need further investigation or further information. Now, we may not be able to score them for various reasons, and that's okay. It may come through as a recommendation to gather more information, so you can kind of give an answer on those hazards. So these two here in relation to risk management. So it's really the outcome of your risk assessment. When you've looked at all the hazards that might cause problems, you've looked at raw water quality that might be available, any trending or problems that are coming out of that, then putting a plan in place. So what, in terms of actions that need to be looked at when a water supplier might try and complete those, who they might work with, who they might collaborate, who's going to implement them, and then there's a tracking element there in terms of, well, was it successful? Why wasn't it successful? Was there constraints in place? Was finances needed? And maybe, you know, something didn't follow through. So a little bit of learnings on that approach in terms of the risk management. And Sarah's going to be giving some examples in this area as well in her talk. Just around stakeholder functions, I have touched on some of this. So I mentioned the implementation guidelines sets out the roles and responsibilities for various stakeholders that's involved in this, and collaboration and partnership approaches is very important. The schemes have been implementing source protection measures for many years, and you're going to hear Shane give some examples and talk about some of the collaboration that has been important in terms of the work that they've undertaken on their scheme. So in terms of the local authority, particularly there as the regulator for the group water schemes, they're responsible to enforce the drinking water regulations with regard to private group schemes and small private supplies. They're there in terms of sharing local knowledge, data and expertise, a supporting role as well with relevant information that might be a benefit to the water suppliers, and also in terms of reviewing the risk assessment and risk management plans that's going to be submitted from water suppliers. Also in terms of support around technical judgment, perhaps in terms of the plans, and maybe around the area of raw water monitoring as well. So just to give a summary in terms of what we've been doing in this space, as I said, the first deadline is July 2027, so we're working towards that in terms of having these plans prepared to help schemes have these plans prepared so they are available for submitting to local authorities. We've been doing a lot of work in recent years, as I mentioned, around water safety planning, and we are now looking at this tool that has been published by the EPA and integrating elements into that plan to make it suitable for the group water scheme sector. The EPA ran some workshops earlier in the summer, and our staff, development officers and our source protection team would have attended that. We've also been doing some group water scheme training with our development officers, trialling, I suppose, the risk assessment process and just fine-tuning that. So, look, we're going to be available to assist the group water schemes in terms of completing their risk assessments and implementing risk management measures. And a lot of schemes are already doing this already. And it's just Shane hasn't seen or looked at the risk assessment tool, but he's already for many years been looking at mitigation actions that he's going to go through as an example. So it's the reporting element now. You're doing a lot of that information work, and a lot of the information is already available, so it's about populating that into a template that has to be reportable to the local authority. We've been doing a lot of work, particularly this year, in terms of gathering the information that's available on schemes. So schemes, a lot of schemes have done preliminary source protection reports, they've done integrated source protection plans. There is a lot of raw water quality being done in the schemes in recent years. A lot of maybe historical quality assurance visits, local knowledge from the group scheme. So you're relying on the staff and the board of the group water scheme to feed into this as well. There's a lot of knowledge that, so it's important to kind of get all that information together, because that's really going to be beneficial in terms of completing the risk assessment. I wanted to mention in terms of the multi-annual allocation, we had allocations in November and last year and July of this year, and Dougie mentioned the allocations this morning as well. So out of that element that he mentioned, there's Measure A1, which relates to source protection. There's nearly 2.5 million has been allocated in that area, and that will cover integrated source protection plans for schemes. So there's 50 schemes that have received funding under the multi-annual, and that will really help provide the scientific proof in terms of identifying risks and helping to put management plans in place. So it will be a great assistance to those schemes in terms of completing their plans. Raw water monitoring has been a big element, and we've really focused a lot of our time in the last couple, since the allocations were announced in November, in terms of getting the raw water monitoring programmes up and running, particularly for the schemes that need to undertake the integrated source protection plans, because you need to have that data there when the consultants are appointed. And also around safe yield assessments, and we heard earlier about abstraction assessments, and that those reports will also be beneficial in that area as well. Just looking in terms of the regulated group water schemes, so we've approximately 370 privately sourced group water schemes. A large portion of them are groundwater. About 80% are groundwater, 20% are surface water. So there's going to be a bit of a variety, even though the template will be the same for everybody. Some will maybe have limited hazards identified and therefore limited risk management, and some of the sources and catchments will be more complex and they will have more detail in theirs. So look, just to summarise, the template is available. As it is, it's available on the EPA website, but we're adding some additions to it in terms for the group water scheme sector. We're there to support the group water schemes in terms of populating these plans and having them ready for 2027. Just something to consider in terms, and Shane will probably talk about this in his talk, around investment that schemes should look at in terms of, well, who's going to manage this plan? Do we need to up our raw water quality monitoring to help with this and help risk manage any issues that might be uncovered? But also looking at not forgetting quality assurance that still is continuing from the abstraction point to the tap. And Eddie gave some examples before lunch in terms of the daily and the weekly monitoring that they're undertaking, and they factor that into the day-to-day running of their scheme. So just some considerations there. The deadline, the 2027 deadline that I've mentioned a couple of times. So look, our development officers will be getting out on the ground, particularly on this issue over the coming weeks and months, and working with schemes in terms of getting those plans up and running. So I'm going to hand you over to Sarah now, who's going to give some practical examples in this area. Gurmeen Mayagat.
Hi everyone. So as Jean said, my name is Sarah Mannion, and I have the role of Source Protection Officer with the Federation. So what I want to do is just break down risk assessment a little bit more for schemes, and also touch on the process following that, which will be risk management. So you heard Jean talking about the need to risk assess and risk manage a group scheme source catchment by 2027, but I'm aware that there are people in the audience that are more familiar with what a group scheme catchment is and what it looks like than others. So when we talk about a group scheme catchment, it's any area of land that can deliver water or potentially deliver nutrients to a group scheme source. So basically, anything within your catchment, any activities that happen there have the potential to either positively or negatively impact your source. So just to let schemes know, as Jean said, group scheme catchments are already delineated. So that means we know the boundary and the shape of your group scheme catchment, and that's where we're going to be focusing our risk assessment and risk management efforts for 2027. So just to go in a little bit more detail of the differences, I suppose, between surface water and groundwater schemes. So to the left there, you can see a surface water scheme, which is 109 kilometres squared, versus the example of a groundwater scheme, which is 0.4 kilometres squared. So just to highlight the difference in size and the difference in work that it might take to risk assess and risk manage these. So you also heard Jean talking about scoring risks. I just thought it'd be no harm to go through a few examples of risks that we will be looking at on group scheme catchments. So one being the risk of crypto in water, agricultural activities causing phosphates and nitrates contamination, transport runoff causing chemical contamination. And then there are other risks that'll be easier to risk off the bat because they may not be an issue for group scheme catchments, they might not be present, like abattoirs causing contamination, forestry activity causing increased sedimentation, or mining causing chemical or metal contamination. So what I want to do now is just go through one or two risks in more detail, go through what information we will use to score the risk. If you risk highly, what mitigation measures could be implemented to alleviate the risk. And I also just wanted to highlight what support and funding is available for schemes throughout this process. So a quick introduction to risk management. It addresses the outcome of your risk assessment. So a management plan needs to be made and implemented based on the risks identified. But also, just to highlight that group schemes won't be alone in this process. Especially for risk management, they can approach other source protection agencies for help, just depending on who might be best placed to implement the relevant measure. So to go through a risk in more detail, the one I picked out here is agricultural activities causing chemical contamination to source. So what we'll be looking at again is the risk of pesticides entering a group scheme source. So what information could we use to assess this? Water quality data is a great place to start. Here, for this risk, we can use both raw and treated water results. Because treatment has such little effect on pesticides, local authority compliance monitoring results can be used here. Similarly, group water schemes who are taking part in their own raw water monitoring, we can use that data, or if an EPA monitoring point is present in a group scheme catchment, we can use data from that. And we'll be able to help schemes identify if there is a monitoring point in your catchment or not. There's also an array of maps that are available to us now which can help us assess this risk. For example, groundwater vulnerability maps and soil hydrology maps. So by using this, it helps us understand the mobility of pesticides in a group scheme catchment. So just as an example, I have on the map there a group scheme catchment, and within it there are poorly draining soils, freely draining soils and peat soils in the catchment. So it can just kind of help us identify what areas might be more risky to lose pesticides to water than others. Another one and an important information to use to assess risks, not just this one but all risks, would be group water scheme local knowledge. So for the group water schemes in the audience, if I asked you to think of one area in your catchment that you think could be risky for pesticides, I bet you could all think of at least one. So it's just that information paired with the science of the water quality data and the maps, which will be a really powerful tool for assessing group scheme catchments. So let's say a risk assessment has been done on your scheme and you've scored highly for pesticides. So what can be done now? So we have to put mitigation actions in place and draw up a risk management plan. So it's important as a starting point to stand back and to look at your catchment as a whole to try and understand where this contamination could be coming from. So for surface water group schemes, a great place to start would be increased raw water monitoring on waterways in the catchment. I know we have group schemes who have done this in the past, and it helped them identify where the largest load of pesticides was being delivered to their source from, and then they could best focus their mitigation actions in the right place. I suppose then for, we'll say, smaller groundwater schemes that might not have this option and mightn't have surface waters going through their catchment, we'll be looking at more of a catchment-wide approach. So it'll be education with farmers and homeowners around the safe use of pesticides near water. So this can be done with flyers, meetings, talks and demonstrations with the local community. I suppose in terms of agricultural mitigation actions, things we can implement will be buffer zones to ensure safe setback distances, drip trays, water tanks, low drift nozzles and weed wiping. I know we have schemes who have really encouraged weed wiping in their catchment and have seen a great reduction in the amount of pesticides in their drinking water. Just another risk to go into in a little bit more detail would be the risk of domestic wastewater treatment systems to group scheme sources. So what information we could use to assess this risk would be the number of one-off houses in a group scheme catchment. So the map there to the right might be a bit difficult to see, but the yellow dots and the red and white dots are all one-off houses. So we'll have access to this in the Federation and we can help group schemes with it. Just kind of gives us an idea of the number of houses in the catchment and also their proximity to a waterway, so we can assess the risk. Again, local knowledge just on a rough age and condition of tanks in the catchment. Microbiological raw water results will be used to assess this risk, and also, again, groundwater vulnerability and soil hydrology maps. These help us because if there was a tank that was not up to standard, it would help us understand the movement that any contamination might have through the catchment. So again, let's just say you risk highly for this as a scheme. What mitigation measures can be put in place? So engagement with homeowners will be key here, like sending out flyers, as the examples on the right, just to encourage local homeowners to get a system tank check. Local authority help could also be got here through septic tank upgrade grants, We've also had group schemes that have taken part in desludging projects as well, which has proved very beneficial. I just wanted to mention that it's not always going to be possible to score a risk. We might have a lack of information available to score it with confidence. For example, let's say we were looking at crypto in a group scheme source. We might not have enough raw water data to look at indicator parameters, and there might not be a crypto risk assessment done, so it might be difficult to score that with confidence. So what can be done then in your risk management plan is selecting a monitoring option. So it could just be a suggestion of maybe increasing raw water monitoring or getting a crypto risk assessment done. One or two things just to consider when you are going through the risk management process is to address the highest risk first. So during your risk assessment, a couple of risks might be highlighted for a group scheme, but it's to just address the highest one first to get more bang for your buck, I suppose. Also just to note, as Jean said, it is a live document, so when group schemes do put in mitigation actions, they're going to have to track the effectiveness of those actions. So it's just kind of about updating your plan as you go, because it will have to be reported back to the local authority every 6 years or potentially sooner, just considering, depending on the risk. So I know it probably sounds very overwhelming for group schemes, but just to drive home that they're not going to be alone in this process. For the risk assessment, we will be helping schemes in the Federation. And then for the risk management side of things, there's support from a lot of different organisations, ourselves being one, LawPro, Teagasc and ASIP advisors, the dairy industry, DAFM are there to help, acres, local authorities, local community groups and many more. And a lot of these have already worked with group water schemes in the past in source protection projects, so we have a really good relationship with them. Also, just to mention a few funding streams that could be done in the risk management process. There's the Farming for Water EIP programme at the moment. So that programme funds farming measures that go above and beyond the GAP regulations to improve water quality in local areas. So a lot of the agricultural mitigation actions that I mentioned earlier on can be funded through this programme. Also, local authority grants could be sought for putting in mitigation actions, as well as LawPro grants. I know the LawPro Community Water Development Fund usually opens between now and Christmas, so if there's schemes with a few projects in mind, just to keep an eye out for its opening. So again, I suppose the take-home message, it might sound daunting, but we're all in it to work together to protect our drinking water sources, not just for 2027, but into the future as well. So I might pass you over to Shane, who will give you a few real-life examples of what it's like on the ground.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shane Curley, and I'm the manager of the Glinsk Creggs Group Water Scheme situated in North East Galway. We're a DBO, as Mike stated earlier on, about 450 houses and close to 900 connections. That's quite a large scheme. Our source is a surface water lake, Loch Lung, so we have our own challenges, obviously, with runoff and into the two rivers that are feeding into that lake. In 2014, we carried out a preliminary source protection report with Dundalk Institute of Technology, and it gave us a good overview of trying to get a measure and on our raw water, and we set up some sample points and started measuring our raw water back then. In 2022, with the help of CDM Smith, we undertook a major integrated source protection plan. And I suppose leading on to the regulations, we're probably in an advanced stage now from a risk assessment and risk management point of view, because we did quite an extensive amount of raw water sampling from April right through to December. It's important that we had group water scheme backing, and all the members on the board were really behind the likes of myself as a manager and gave me every support that was needed to carry out the task. So with the integrated source protection plan, the contaminants or the issues of concern for us were total phosphorus, some E. coli in the raw water, sediment or the turbidity, water discoloration. We're very much an agricultural area, and we have a lot of boglands and forestry as well, so there was colour issues with the water, and we did have traces of MCPA showing up in certain areas, and also glyphosate. We didn't have too many concerns about nitrogen runoff or ammonium or nitrite or nitrates. So what do? We sampled 10 different sample points around the catchment, and every fortnight we sampled this. It's important to note that there was significant investment put in at the start from the group water scheme. So we spent somewhere in the region of about €30,000 getting a very concise level of measurements, and it was hugely beneficial. We quickly identified one area between two sample points that needed some mitigation measures. And we continue to measure these sample points on an ongoing basis, minimum once a year, but we're trying to get it to twice a year. So how did we go about the mitigation measures? Well, firstly, we had funding available to us from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and the project was led by the National Federation of Group Water Schemes. And I had fantastic support, especially from Sean Corrigan. Lots of you might know Sean Corrigan at the time, and his knowledge was invaluable to me. The first steps was getting the farmer on board, or the landowner on board. And what we did first was we engaged with 5 or 6 farmers from the outset on that stretch of river. It took us 5 or 6 weeks to get to land the first one, but we were able to go with the science-based approach. We had the readings from the river sampling, and it's vital that you don't go and blame somebody in an area that it's your fault that the river sample readings are because of some of the practices that you're putting in. So it's not a finger-pointing exercise. So when we engaged the first farmer, we had a small piece of land on a fairly busy road, and we used it as a kind of a showcase site. We fenced it off, put in a new gate, put in a lovely new water trough, and we were able to explain to the rest of the landowners, why don't you take a drive up here to this particular area, have a look at what we're doing. And there was a kind of a ripple effect then from there on in, and all of the farmers came on board. So once we had the land agreements and everything in place, the contractors took over, and we have about 10.5 kilometres of fencing put in at the moment along the water courses to prevent animal access, to provide buffer strips, and to break the pollution pathways and create enhanced biodiversity habitats. We have just under 1.5 hectares of buffer areas, and they include smart buffer areas that we planted native trees in. We also had a lot of associated site work, so we had to, in some cases, give an alternative drinking water solution. So where you're blocking out the animals from the river, we had to put in maybe a meter box and supply some piping and drinking water troughs, shut off valves for those troughs for the winter time, etc. And then in some cases where feasible, we planted native hedgerows in behind that fencing just to also help with biodiversity. And we created a distribution, we distributed a flyer there outlining good agricultural practices. So it's all about community engagement. When this was going on, everyone in the village was talking about it. Oh, look at the fencing that such and such a fella got, and God, I wonder would I be able to get that. And we ended up in a scenario where some landowners actually missed out, even though they expressed interest. We didn't have time because of the constraints due to the having to put in for funding, etc. But we're working with some farmers now as well to try and roll out something. We have also, with that integrated source protection plan, we put in 2 drinking water refill stations, one at each school in both the villages of Glinsk and Creggs. And just to make everybody aware of what's going on and the importance of water, we visited both schools, we've had numerous talks with them, and we rolled out the I've planted a tree and my garden is pesticide free projects in both schools. We gave all of the children some information, we gave them a native tree for them to plant in their own garden. We ran a kick sampling project as well, which was invaluable, and the children absolutely loved that. And they took ownership of scoring how good the quality of the raw water was by the creepy crawlies that were in there. They were able to measure that off the different charts. And we've also just recently in January, and Sarah was down with us, among others in Glinsk, we ran a slurry spreading information day for all the local contractors, just making them aware of the dangers as well and the protection of our water sources. And in the past, we have carried out septic tank desludging projects also. So it's quite clear the benefits of source protection. Everything that we do here today is all about water quality. The better quality our raw water is, the easier it is to treat. And we all know the costs that are involved in treating water. So protecting our raw water is hugely important. When you get out on the ground, it also helps you understand the risks. You can have all the maps you want, looking at all the screens, but when you actually get out on the land, you can get a real feel for what's going on land. You'll also help with the farmer, with the landowner, in improving the farming practices, and you'll build relationships with them. They're all still waving to me anyway every time I meet them in the car anyway, so I presume we've done a good enough of a job. And it's great for support in the community. And there's a sense of pride as well when you drive by a particular piece of land and you can say, you know, we did that. And I'd like to think that you try and leave something in a better way than what you found it. There's multiple environmental benefits in the link between water, biodiversity, and climate change. But there are challenges, and there's no point in denying that. It does take time. It took a lot of time for me. I'm a full-time manager, and we spent huge efforts to try and get it off the ground. There was some difficulties onboarding people. I won't say they jumped at the idea. It was like going to the disco back in the day and seeing someone across the floor and asking them to dance 4 different times and being refused, and now you're married to them. But and then there was others. I remember arranging a meeting with one particular landowner, and he said, "Sure, call down to the house, Shane, and we'll have a chat about it." So I went down at about 6 o'clock in the evening, and after speaking about football and hurling and births, deaths and marriages and everything in between, and about 6 cups of tea and a half a packet of biscuits, and I went in with a full head of hair, and the rest is history. So at about 2 o'clock in the morning, then he says, sure, look at Shane, I'm not really interested in that at all. So, those are the things that you get, but nonetheless, the conversation was good and we had good fun. So there is work involved, and we had difficulties with weather. It just seemed to rain and rain and rain and rain on top of us when we were fencing, and at times you felt guilty going into people's land, but we were trying to sell them a vision that, I should think about this now when it's June next year and the sun is shining down on top of that fencing. It'll be all worth it in the end. So just to summarise, anyone that's thinking of getting involved in an ISPP or any source protection measures, don't be afraid to start. It is hard work, but it is hugely rewarding. Take small steps. As I said, we started off with about 6 different farmers getting engaged, but it was until we got the first one that everything else started. So try and work with someone that's very approachable and that understands what you want at the end of the day. You will need to put in some investment and resources from your group water scheme. It's not just all going to come from funding, and you may have to start from your own kind of bank account first to get up and running. And having that commitment from your board is vital. As I said, I had the backing of my board, and they supported me in everything that I did, and I'm very grateful for them. Collaboration is also key, and communication. That is so important. Don't try and pull the wool over somebody's eyes. If you make an arrangement with somebody and you're going to fence off one particular area, you fence off that area. Don't just try and, Asher, I'll take that corner as well, he won't mind. Keep everybody in the loop and you'll have no issues. And measure the success. We've measured our raw water on that particular stretch of river, and it has improved. Not drastically, but it has improved. And the supports are available. The Federation have been fantastic. They really have. Everyone in the office, and I mentioned Sean earlier on, pick up the phone and just ask them, for the little steps that it needs to take. And with the science, there's the living proof. When you go with that document and say, this is what the science says, you're not going to be making it up as you go along. So I wish you all the best. Thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you have.